turn you over to Mr. Frederick Douglass. Mr. Douglass.
Thank you, citizen. And good afternoon, or should I say good evening, fellow citizens. I am yours truly, Frederick Douglass. And I'm certainly indeed delighted to be back again, invited back to the Hampton History Museum here in Hampton, Virginia. This time, under peculiar circumstances, I understand that your country, the country, is going through a pandemic, something I'm not altogether unfamiliar with. Certainly, in our time, we had yellow fever, scarlet fever, that were in various areas. So we, at various times throughout the decades, every decade or so, we would have an outbreak, and we would have to curtail our travel as to where we might be going at a particular time. Of course, our means of transportation at that time were quite limited, and thus the spread of any thing like that would be limited. I understand now your carriages and your mass transportation and trains and such would make it very likely that, and I understand it is now a global event. And so I'm here today speaking to you with the advent of your technology. The cameras of my day, the only person behind the camera would have been the photographer himself. But as I understand it now, a whole audience of people can peer through the camera and see me speaking. So, before I get started on this topic of woman suffrage and what little I contributed to that cause in my time as an abolitionist and standing for universal suffrage, I wanted to speak briefly on some of the organizations, women's organizations, that I have been privy to meet in my travels in the modern era. You might say, how did I get here? Of course, obviously someone opened a book and invited me to speak. And I've been very fortunate in this modern era that you have been interested in what we had to say in the 19th century, and I've been called by many organizations. And so this list of organizations that I'm going to mention is not any resume that I am giving you of what I have accomplished, but rather a list or an introduction to organizations that women who are listening should consider if you are going to be civically engaged in your civil rights, your economic, political, and civil rights. These organizations are not, they are contemporary organizations that are active now, fighting for teaching you history and giving you an idea of what you need to do in your society to win equal rights. And so I have had the privilege of speaking to organizations like the Equal Rights Amendment Organization, the Black National Women's Conference, which is right here in Hampton Roads. There's an organization that I met several years ago called Women in Defense. This is an organization of women who are entrepreneurs and make their living, their businesses are supported by government contracts. The Daughters of the American Revolution. There are many chapters throughout the area of the Hampton Roads area. Chesapeake has a very active organization of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Edenton has the Tea Party chapter, which was one of the first Daughters of the American Revolution organizations. And I was down there not too long ago speaking to the Tea Party of the Daughters of the American Revolution in Edenton, North Carolina. Just so many, including an organization that's in Rochester, out of the Rochester and Syracuse area, First Vote, First Amendment, which is an organization that has a mission of teaching young women in high school to become part of the political process and possibly become political candidates. So all these are ways or organizations that I feel certainly that you should be supporting in the modern era, becoming members of, having your daughters become members of, so that you can continue whatever you have not achieved at the ballot box to make sure that you are fully enfranchised in American society. Now, that is done, I wanted to speak to you on this peculiar topic of woman suffrage. Of course, I was born on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County near St. Michael's around the year 1818. Now, you may not know that my birth name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And I was born around the year 1818, although I do not know the exact date of my birth, as most slaves did not know the dates of their births. The closest we could come would be planting time or harvest time. Of course, slave masters and their children celebrated, they knew the dates of their births and celebrated dates of births, but we children as slaves had no idea of our record of birth. Occasionally we did, but I did not. I ended up choosing February 14th as my birthday. That might be of some note to you that I chose Valentine's Day as my birthday. And that was because my mother, who was taken away from me when I was but an infant, still nursing, torn from her breast and given to my grandmother to be raised on that plantation. And my mother sold to a plantation about 12 miles away. And she would occasionally walk round trip 24 miles just to rock me to sleep at night. And by the time I woke the next morning, she would be gone back to her field to work in the field. But I do remember when she brought me a heart-shaped cake, and she called me her little Valentine. And so when I had a chance, after I had escaped from bondage, deciding on a date to have celebrate my birthday, I chose February 14th. But I did manage, and of course, anything that I might be saying to you here would be a fair representation of what it would have been like to be a slave on any plantation in America. Some of it was awfully brutal. It was a brutal institution. And once I had an opportunity to free myself, I fought to abolish that slavery in this country. I remember escaping around the age of around 18 years old and making my way from Baltimore to New York, where I met my wife, my future wife, Anna Mary, and we got married by Reverend Pennington, and we stayed there in Massachusetts for a while. When I met Mr. William Lord Garrison and the Garrisonians and that movement, and they asked me to stand up and start speaking on behalf of the abolition of slavery, to tell my story of what it was like to be in bondage. And so there I did. And I immediately began being ridiculed by those who were hearing my story to say that, well, maybe he's not even a slave. He sounds so articulate. You say this man can read and write. Maybe he's not a slave at all. He's some Negro who has been to college and you're passing him off as a slave. Well, the answer then was for me to write a narrative, and I started my first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And when I wrote that narrative, the bounty on my head went up considerably. As a matter of fact, I was instructed that it would be best that I leave the country. And so I had left my wife and two of my children at that time, and I was shipped over. I think we sailed to Liverpool on the RMS Cambria, and I spent was only supposed to spend 4 days in Ireland, but I ended up spending 4 months in that country. I traveled everywhere from the Giant's Causeway to Cape Fear, and then on to England, where I stayed another 18 months or so. And it gave me a worldview of the abolition of slavery. Of course, at that time, England had already abolished slavery. And so I had a new perspective on the concept of slavery and suffrage, the suffrage of people in bondage and disenfranchised people. Those people in England helped me raise money to purchase my freedom. Julia Griffiths and the Richardson family raised $733 to help me purchase my freedom. They raised another $2,500 on my bequest that I start a newspaper. And so when I arrived back in America, I moved my family from Lynn, Massachusetts to Rochester. And here is where, through divine intervention, and that's the only way I can possibly describe the chain of events that had me introduced to many of the women who would eventually start standing beside and supporting them in the right for their suffrage. I was basically moving to Rochester to start my newspaper, the North Star. I certainly had in mind and had been following the suffrage movement. I had already been following women, certainly great African-American women like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, as well as Lucretia Mott, who, for all intents and purposes, you could call really the mother of the suffrage movement. Mrs. Mott started out in Philadelphia. She had a vigorous suffrage movement and anti-slavery movement. She was a Quaker, and she was staunchly against slavery and fought for the abolition of slavery. And they had all kinds of movements. They were started in Philadelphia. They refused to purchase any goods that were made by slaves. They had black and white women in the movement in Philadelphia. They had the audacity to even establish the Philadelphia Hall, where speeches could be made on behalf of the abolition of slavery and woman suffrage. Well, of course, at that time, those slavery people who wanted to continue the institution of slavery were quite radical. And the Philadelphia Hall only stood for about a week. After one of the biggest conferences there, speeches, it was immediately burned to the ground. They had Mrs. Mott as a target. After burning down the Philadelphia Hall, those slaveholders, those Southerners, were running through the streets looking for the Mott house. Where is the Mott house? They wanted to burn down Mrs. Mott's house and possibly kill her. Fortunately, they couldn't find her, and certainly if they had, she might have been killed that day. She was not the type of woman who would stand down with any confrontation. And so just to give you any kind of idea of what opposition you might be facing in this modern era to your stand for equal rights, for the suffrage that you may not, the equal suffrage you might not be experiencing in this modern era, imagine outright violence to you even having a voice in the public square, that you exercising your First Amendment rights, that you would actually have physical violence. So if you're having anything less than physical violence, I would say to you, lean forward and fight for your suffrage. What do you have to lose? So Mrs. Mott, and I think where she really got her reputation was in 1840 when her husband and another young lady that I had the privilege of knowing quite well, my age, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and her husband, they all attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England. Now, of course, this was a worldwide convention, and Mrs. Mott had every intention of attending the conference and having a say-so. And her husband supported her in every way. I met her husband and her son when I set up shop in Rochester. When I set up my newspaper, their business, their insurance business, was right across the street. And this is where I met Mrs. Mott's husband. And I met her. And so I knew they were both staunch abolitionists. And they got over to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, and the women were denied the right to speak. Their husbands, sure, speak. Even Mr. Garrison was there. He was offered an opportunity to speak. But those were men of conviction, and so they decided to sit in the balcony with the women and not speak because they were standing with the women. And of course, Mrs. Mott didn't take too kindly of it. She went into the streets and wrote some editorials to the newspapers claiming her rights for equal suffrage. And she came back with this reputation of being the Lioness of London. So by the time they arrived back in Seneca Falls, they had quite enough of a society which only gave them privilege and not equal rights. They were well aware of what they found when they visited the Haudenosaunee tribes, the Native American tribes in North America, which had a matriarchal society with women sitting in the longhouse making decisions with the Iroquois Nation. These were women, a matriarchal society, that were telling men what to do, who had rights, not just privileges. And it became quite apparent to these women, even though they were white women, that they had some privilege but no rights. They could not own land, they could not run a business, even their personal possessions and their children. In the event that their husbands decided to divorce them, their husbands could take not only their property, but their children as well, and leave them out in the wilderness with barren, basically. And so they decided to write what they called a Declaration of Sentiments. Now, certainly Miss Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the daughter of a prominent lawyer and who was quite a skilled writer, helped draft this document. They met in Waterloo at a little house that was owned by the McClintocks. And they sat there in the office of the McClintock house, Mrs. McClintock, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott, and they drafted this Declaration of Sentiments, much like the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And they outline the rights that they demanded that they be given. And they planned this first women's suffrage conference in Seneca Falls. And they sent me a telegram. They sent a telegram to me at the North Star newspaper that they were having this conference in just about 3 days. I hardly had time to put anything in the paper, but they had also extended an invitation to me to come to Seneca Falls and be a part of this first women's conference. And so, of course, I caught a train and I made case to Seneca Falls. And on the 18th and 19th, they held that conference, and there were hundreds of people who came to the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. Now, eventually, after they set up and read the Declaration of Sentiments, they had a number of amendments that they were signed and approved, and then about 68 women and 32 men signed that Declaration of Sentiments. I was the only black man there and the only black man of 32 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. And there were great speeches that day, and the hall was full of jubilation. Of course, everybody there was not there to necessarily encourage the women. There were many people outside chastising them, ridiculing them for having the audacity to draft such a document and demand their equal rights. But I remember that day very distinctly. They asked me to be the master of ceremony. And I remember looking out over the hall there at the Wesleyan Chapel that all the men and women gathered. And I made a speech. Now, I won't labor you too long. I know the speeches of our day were quite lengthy. The speech I gave that day was about 45 minutes long, and we don't have that much time here. But I did want to give you an example or an excerpt of what I did say to that audience that day as I supported their case, their case for equal rights. I remember standing up and looking around to Mrs. Mott and to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I said as much this: Mrs. President, ladies and gentlemen, I come to this platform with unusual diffidence. Although I have been long identified with the woman suffrage movement and have often spoken in its favor, I am at somewhat of a loss to know what to say on this really great and uncommon occasion where so much has been said. When I look around on this assembly and I see the many able and eloquent women full of subject and ready to speak, I would not now speak, but for my early connection with the cause and having been called to do so by this council. Men have very little business here as speakers. If they come here at all, they should take the back benches and wrap themselves in silence. For this is an international council, not for men, but for women. And woman should have all there is to say in it. This is her day in court. I've heard many men speak on this subject, some of them the most eloquent to be found anywhere in the country. But I believe no man, however gifted in thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of woman with the skill and effect, with the power and authority of woman herself. He can neither speak for her, nor act for her, nor vote for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of the way and give her the opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality. Her right to be and to do is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth. I say to her as I say to the colored people, give her fair play and hands off. There may be some well-meaning people in this audience who have never attended a woman suffrage conference, never heard a woman suffrage speech, never read a woman suffrage newspaper. And they may be surprised that those who speak here do not argue the question. The demand of the hour is not argument, but assertion, firm and inflexible assertion which has more power than the force of an argument. If there's any argument to be made, it should be made by the opponents, not by the friends of the woman suffrage. They will find not one reason, not one consideration that can be urged supporting the right of men to vote that does not equally support the right of women to vote. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. Time itself is a very conservative power. That what is, always was, and always will be, world without end. We have heard this old argument before, ladies. And if you live very long, you shall hear it again. Man has become so accustomed to command and woman to obey that both parties have hardened to their respective places and thus has piled up a mountain of iron against woman's franchisement. Such a truth is woman's right to equal liberty with man. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it, and no custom law or usage can ever destroy it. So the women who have thus far caused this agitation have already embodied Theodore Parker's 3 grades of human greatness. First, greatness in executive and administrative ability. Secondly, greatness in the ability to organize. And thirdly, in the ability to discover truth. They are seen in the steady growth of the movement, not only in this country, but around the world. And this cause, it's heard whenever the mantra is read out loud, especially from our newspaper. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Well, my speech was very warmly received. Applause and a great clamoring. But of course, as I said in the speech, my speech was secondary to anything that the woman might have said that day, and certainly secondary to the Declaration of Sentiments. Those people signed that declaration, and it was our intent to take that Declaration of Sentiments and move that forward across the country. Of course, not without some serious backlash. Immediately, the characterization of the Seneca Falls Convention was one that it was lackluster, that it was actually, absolutely a bad thing for women to be speaking on behalf of their own rights. And there was quite a bit of scorn from the neighborhood. People actually accosted. There were actually people who had signed the Declaration of Sentiments who unfortunately took back their signatures. This was because their businesses were threatened, their livelihoods were threatened, their homes were threatened by those people who wanted to continue not only slavery, but to keep women as subjects. But nevertheless, we forged forward. The next convention was in Rochester, twice as large as Seneca Falls. And then from there, more people signing the Declaration of Sentiments, and then on to Syracuse and other cities, and it just moved right across the country. I believe you all have this the same thing going on in the modern era, as you were trying to, as I understand it, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is the extension of the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding not just that you have it on paper, not that just you give women the right to vote, but that you give them equal suffrage, that you give them full enfranchisement in American society. And until that is done, well, you keep on agitating. And so I was quite surprised when I came back to this modern era and I'm reading your history that you have achieved that. And that this year, the year of our Lord, 2020, if you believe it or not, that women do have the right to vote. I've come back, though, and one of the things that has been quite surprising is although you have made that accomplishment, is that unfortunately many don't understand their rights. They don't understand that amendment. There are quite a few people in America these days who don't understand the Constitution. They think it's a dead letter, and that once the amendments that currently exist, including the 19th Amendment, that's all there is. Well, I'm here to tell you that this Constitution that I carry around with me is not a dead letter. You should be, after you cast your vote in the ballot box, you should be continuing to agitate for whatever rights that you don't have. What you have to understand is that even after the Civil War, and the 13th and 14th Amendments, which gave black men their freedom, their citizenship, and the right to vote, that there were people who wanted to take that back. They established Reconstruction to help secure those amendments, to make sure and bring the Negro into full enfranchisement in American society. But there were people fighting against that, to take that back. And so it's a continuous process that you cannot just cast your vote at the ballot box and then expect those leaders to do all the work for you. You have to continue to agitate on your own behalf. And the examples that these women did in those times in my area, the 19th century, were maybe some that you should be taking on yourselves. They gathered in organizations like the ones I mentioned at the top of the hour. They raised money so that those representatives they had for their causes could travel, could have places to stay, could have venues to speak at. And so they did all sorts of things. They donated money. They sold goods. They had quilting associations, and they made quilts and sold the quilts to raise money, just so that they could be able to travel and finance their ideas. These are things that I certainly would recommend that you read upon and maybe give them an updated touch, a modern touch on how you're going to continue your fight for equal enfranchisement in American society. But I guess one of maybe the little known things about my time and my relationship with the suffrage movement was, of course, that after the Civil War, when it came time on this 15th Amendment, which, of course, by this time, Susan B. Anthony was on the scene. There were so many women. Frances E.W. Harper, who was a black woman, a very talented poet and speaker. Sojourner Truth, all of these women, and I was traveling with all these women making the case for universal suffrage. And of course, in most of the places that we went, there was great pushback. When I took Frances E.W. Harper with me into Ohio for a black conference to speak to black men who had gained their freedom, the black men did not want to hear Frances E.W. Harper speak. They were saying that, well, we have the right to vote, we should take our right to vote, and the women can wait. And the general consensus came out in the end that the window of opportunity for the black man to vote was a very narrow window that did not permit the women to enter at that time. And so I had to make a decision as to whether I would stand back and not vote for the amendment or not support the amendment, or to stand for the black man's right to vote in the hopes that this window of opportunity that we went to, we would be able to reach through and bring the women along in short order. Well, that didn't happen. Once that 15th Amendment was passed, the scorn that I got from my sisters in the suffrage movement, especially Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was severe and direct. Of course, Miss Anthony had put herself in jail. She had actually physically voted against the law in Rochester, got locked up. She said she would rather cut off her right arm than give up the right to vote. And so that lets you know where she stood right there and the passion she had behind winning the woman's right to vote. And so when that 15th Amendment passed, she certainly thought that I had left her behind and all the people who had previously been helping them had let them down. I tried to make the argument. I was not just fighting for the white women's right to vote. I was fighting for the black women's right to vote. My wife, Anna Mary, was a black woman. My daughter, Rosetta, was a black woman that I wanted to have that right to vote. And so I was fully invested in the woman's right to vote, no doubt about it. I wanted Sojourner Truth. I wanted Harriet Tubman, the Sojourn, the co-pilot of the Underground Railroad. I wanted these women to have the right to vote. But that window of opportunity was quite small. And so there was a falling out. There was a cold winter where Well, there was no chatter, no conciliation. There was no talk between myself or any of the men who were supporting the women in their right for suffrage. And unfortunately, there was quite a bit of ground lost in those decades following the 15th Amendment. And it was a thing that I think maybe you all might want to take note of, about understanding whatever kind of coalitions you have in this modern era, and how, number one, who you have in the coalition, where those people come from, what are their standings, what are their race, their socioeconomic status. All these things have a bearing on how you keep the coalition together in good times and rough times. Because as soon as something happens that someone can exploit the cracks in the foundation of your coalition, it can certainly put you back decades, if not completely. And so, of course, I was not shocked at some of the things that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had to say. Of course, they saw me as an intelligent black man, but they literally said that the Negroes or the other black men who were totally uneducated should not be voting in front of white women. Well, it was their race and their privilege that came to bear. It was not something that I did not realize, that I was working with women of quite privilege. Mrs. Mott came out of a quite wealthy class. The Grimke sisters, they left their wealth to come on the side of the abolition, which is notable. But when you run into a brick wall, then you tend to lean back on your class and privilege as to why you should not be disenfranchised. And so let's say that I believe you all finally got the right to vote in 1920, which is quite a bit of time. I would have certainly hoped that we would have been able to reach back and bring the women along long before 1920. But now that you do have that right, I would certainly encourage you all to make sure that those who are standing in the way of your full enfranchisement are met with serious agitation. I would encourage you all to go out and to join organizations in your community that will bring together women like the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's not just a white organization. You do understand that the American Revolution was fought, the people who sacrificed for this country were black and white. So if you are a black woman sitting there saying, well, the Daughters of the American Revolution, that's an organization of the other persuasion. No, not at all. The black men and men of Massachusetts, Crispus Attucks, these were black men that gave their lives and sacrificed for the American Revolution. Mom Bet, you might want to read the history of this notable black woman who sacrificed her life for the American Revolution. You might be a descendant of a woman who was in the American Revolution. So these are ways that you can continue to fight for your full enfranchisement in American society. You can prevent something happening like what happened to the black man after the Civil War, where Reconstruction began to unravel, and many of the gains that were and the promises of 40 acres and a mule were basically taken away. I ended up being the president of the Freedmen's Bank and Trust. Now, the Freedmen's Bank and Trust was just one component of Reconstruction, where this bank was established to make sure that black businessmen farmers had somewhere to put their money that they could trust and to make loans so that they could start businesses, buy land, build homes, churches, and schools and such. Well, by the time that I took over that institution after John Mercer Langston, well, the coffers of that bank had been pilfered, embezzlement. The bank was basically, well, it was broke. I put $20,000 of my own money into the bank, and it still went belly up. And so this was all because there were people on the other side who disagreed with the amendments passed, with the Reconstruction, and they started to try to take away not just the Freedmen's Bank, not just 40 acres and a mill, but our right to vote. There were people killed at the ballot box. There were riots. And so, women, with your right to vote comes great responsibility. We want you to be not only have the right to vote, but to have your place in the jury box as well. Not just the ballot box, but the jury box. Well, I think that gives you a good idea of all the things, what I saw from my perspective as Frederick Douglass and supporting women and their right to vote, and what I was able to contribute to the cause, some of the pitfalls that we experienced, and still you were able to prevail. I congratulate the women of the modern era for having the right to vote, for exercising the right to vote, and for continuing to fight, to agitate for your full enfranchisement in American society, social, political, and political equality. So at this time, I think I've been talking quite long enough. There might be some questions from the audience that I might be able to answer. I'll certainly answer any questions that I can.
Mr. Douglass?
Yes.
Seamus McGran with the Hampton History Museum. I actually don't have any questions right now
Okay.
for you.
All right.
But I encourage people to send them in.
Yes.
We'll keep looking for them.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you, I did get one letter just prior to my daughter Rosetta brought me in a letter from a concerned citizen, and she seemed in her letter quite depressed about everything going on in this modern era. Not only the political climate, but as well the pandemic and having lost friends, relatives in the pandemic. I understand this is a very difficult time. I have you know that I can certainly understand, and I certainly give my sympathies to any person, any American who has lost relatives, who has suffered through this pandemic. And you all are experiencing quite a number of deaths, which is surprising because you have the advent of modern medicine, which we did not. I have you know that I lost one of my children, Annie. She passed away when she was 10 years old. Now, what we called it at that time was consumption, but it was basically pneumonia, where something attacked her lungs and she could not breathe. As a matter of fact, I was out of the country at the time. This was around the time that right after John Brown had raided Harper's Ferry, they found documents on John Brown that would have them believe that I was an accomplice in his plot to raid Harper's Ferry. And so there was a bounty put out on my head, and I immediately left the country. I was in Europe at the time, and my daughter, she comes down with consumption and passes away. And I get a letter the saying, my daughter Annie has passed away, and of course, regardless of the bounty on my head, I found a ship and sailed back to America. Medicine was rudimentary. The infant mortality rate was quite severe. I had 5 children: Charles, Lewis, Frederick Jr., Rosetta, and of those who lived, Annie did not live, they had many grandchildren. I had more than a dozen grandchildren, and only 4 of them lived to be adults. And so, who knows better than yours truly what it's like to lose a family member when something could have been done. My wife suffered for almost a decade. The whole time that we lived in Washington, D.C., I had moved from Rochester to Washington, D.C. I purchased a house there, Cedar Hill. It's a grand house. At the time, it had 14 rooms. I expanded it to 21 rooms just so that I could have a place for my friends and family who were coming out of bondage could have a place to stay. And my wife, who had been taking care of the home and the family and being the hostess throughout my entire time as an abolitionist, was suffering. And so she died before her time. So now that you are in this pandemic, what I would say to you is that to stay strong, to look out for your fellow man, do what it takes. I understand that the modern medicine works quicker than anything we would have seen in the 19th century. And I certainly hope that there is a cure on the horizon for you all. But you have to work together. You have to have a sense of citizenship with all the side effects that come from a serious situation like this, of people who can't work, people who can't feed themselves, people who are going hungry. This is a time when Americans stand together, regardless of, well, they look out for one another. The way that we poor people looked out for one another during slavery, regardless of race. There were masterless men who were slaves without shackles, who helped, who in some cases were more impoverished than slaves, and we helped feed one another. These are the things that you might be able to find if you look into a history book that might give you some direction on where you go in your future.
Mr. Douglass.
Yes.
I do believe your most recent comments have prompted some questions. One, I think, is were black fathers allowed to advocate for their daughters at this time?
Well, black fathers certainly could not advocate for their daughters, or even themselves for that matter. Before the Civil War, with the institution of slavery, and then even thereafter, a black man had no recourse in a court of law. I can remember even when I was in Fells Point, Baltimore, that I was working in the shipyard, and I was accosted by 12 men on the street, beaten to a pulp. A man hit me in the eye with a brick and almost knocked my right eye out. And when I went back to my master and told him what had happened, he was quite incensed that they had accosted me this way. And we went down to the constable's office, and he was immediately received pushback to say, well, who saw this incident? Well, there were other men there. There was probably 40 men there witnessing the thing, but none of them were white men that would stand up. And so in a court of law, a black man could not testify even in defense of another black man. It had to be a white man that would stand on your side. And so probably the best example that I could give you of a black man trying to stand up in defense of his family and his daughters would have been Dred Scott. Dred Scott, who you might be familiar with this Supreme Court case where Judge Tawney passed down a ruling that Dred Scott could not achieve his freedom even after he was moved, and his family, his wife and his two daughters, moved into free territory, which should have automatically given them their freedom. They were denied their rights. This decision dissolved the Missouri Compromise. And so that gives you an idea of the position, the predicament that a black man was in those days, to have his family sold down south to Mississippi or Alabama.
Thank you. Another question. You mentioned you're expanding your home in Washington, D.C. That speaks to a question we have is, what was your source of income?
Well, I certainly, prior to arriving in Washington, D.C., most of my income came from book sales. I had, by that time, written 2 autobiographies. My first was a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And then that was followed by Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And so I certainly spoke widely. I traveled. Some of my speaking engagements brought in as much as $200 for a speaking engagement. But when I arrived in Washington, D.C., I was actually was able to land some positions that paid a wage. I was first on the court records. I was a records keeper for the deeds and property in Washington, D.C. Then I got an assignment as the provost for the District of Columbia. And then I had certain assignments. I eventually, of course, I mentioned previously that I got a position following John Mercer Langston at the bank. And then I was also appointed as the ambassador to Haiti. And the commission, General Grant assigned me on the commission for the annexation of the Dominican Republic. And so these all helped me finance the things that I wanted to do. I ended up buying property. Of course, I bought Cedar Hill, as you, I don't know if you are aware of this, was I believe I paid $12,000 for Cedar Hill. And then I also purchased property, and I built 5 apartments in the very place that I was once a slave in Fells Point, Baltimore. And I rented those properties out, and I made sure that I allowed equal justice. Whoever wanted to rent the property, black or white, had no restrictions on who wanted to rent the property. And so I was fortunate to be come from chattel property to a property owner.
Thank you. I have a couple more. One I will read verbatim because it's a very clear question. What are your views regarding the importance of education for yourself, for our society, and in maintaining our constitutional republic?
Well, I certainly agree that education is a very important part of us achieving the things we want to achieve in society. I wrote a speech. Many people might say, even in your look back at history, that I might have had some disagreement with Booker T. Washington and his philosophy on education versus my philosophy. I wrote a speech, Self-Made Men, in which I spelled out all classes of men, including those who worked in the field, those who were from the college, that they were all important. Because what I understand is that not until I was able to read and write was I even had an idea of what freedom was. I did not understand that I was a slave until I was able to read the word abolition. and read the definition thereof of what I should be doing to gain my freedom. And that came through reading and writing. And so it was those things that I was denied that I wanted most and motivated me to gain my freedom. They had a saying, as a matter of fact, don't teach a Negro to read. If you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. So don't teach him how to read. He'll want his freedom. He'll become unruly. And that was actually true, because as soon as I started reading, then I became quite restless, and I wanted to gain my freedom. And so education gives you freedom. And especially for children, you certainly want to teach your children well. Better to build strong children than repair broken men.
Thank you. Wise words indeed. And as we are running short on time, I'm going to invite Mr. Richardson back to rejoin us and answer our final question: is where can we find more to read about Mr. Douglass?
Well, reading is certainly how I knew anything at all. My first book that I bought was 75 cents, was this very book right here. It's called The Columbian Orator. It's full of great speeches and poems, and I delved into this book. There are lessons in here from Plato and Socrates on public speaking. And then I continued to purchase books, literary and science. By the time I believe my library at Cedar Hill had about 5,000 books. And I always wanted to read both sides of the equation and make up my own intelligent mind about reading and understanding the issue. And so I would certainly encourage you all to get books that have two different arguments, read those books, understand the situation, and then make up your mind about the course you should take, the stand you should make, what kind of agitation you should have in making sure that you and your family and your children have a life and live up to this ideal of society and the American dream. So from my perspective as an understudy, I got some good advice. Now, this is Nathan Richardson talking, that if you're going to take on a character like Frederick Douglass, you want to read Frederick Douglass before you read autobiographies. And I was very fortunate. Frederick Douglass has 3 autobiographies. He actually wrote a novella. He had thousands of letters. He had hundreds of pages of newspapers that he published with the North Star. So for the first 2 years, almost 2.5 years, all I read was Frederick Douglass. I was very fortunate that people who were following me, you all still send me books. And I read them, I really do, because I spend a lot of time researching. But I definitely spent my first years reading just what Frederick Douglass said about himself before I read anybody else's interpretation of who Frederick Douglass was. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us again at our Port Hampton virtual lecture series. Thank you, Nathan. You're always welcome here. I hope you think of this as your second home, and join us again soon.
Thank you.